Ladies and gentlemen, the special guards of honor who will accompany Madame Zhang's car into the bowl are cadets of the Chinese Air Force, recently arrived from their native country for training at Thunderbird Field, Arizona. The producer is particularly grateful for the wholehearted support given by the people of the Chinese community of Los Angeles, each and every one of whom has been eager to participate in one way or another in this program. And now, ladies and gentlemen, it is our pleasure to present to you one of the truly great and distinguished artists of our day, Spencer Tracy.
Ladies and gentlemen, I am here to introduce to you a reception committee of the 20 most outstanding feminine stars of the motion picture world, who are here to salute in deep humility a woman of China whose fame will reach beyond the bounds of any time to immortality. They are here as women and as Americans to pay simple and respectful tribute to this gentle and inspiring woman who will today do us so great an honor by her presence. And now, ladies and gentlemen, let me introduce the committee. Miss Mary Pickford, Miss Joan Bennett, and Miss Ingrid Bergman, Miss Marlena Dietrich and Miss Irene Dunn, Miss Deanna Durbin and Miss Kay Francis, Miss Judy Garland and Miss Janet Gaynor, Miss Rita Hayworth and Miss Dorothy Lamour, Miss Ida Lupino and Miss Ginger Rogers, Miss Rosalind Russell and Miss Norma Shearer, Miss Barbara Stanwyck and Miss Shirley Temple, Miss Lana Turner and Miss Loretta Young. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I should like to present to you one of the many motion picture artists now in the armed services. Henry Fonda, Seaman First Class, United States Navy.
Thank you, Spencer, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen. And now, with your permission, I'd like to introduce somebody myself. The man I'm going to introduce is in the Navy, too, but it's no idle flattery to say that he has seen more and done more than most of us in the Navy ever will. The President told the story of Commander Wassell April 28, 1942, and it's now my great honor to introduce him again to you. Commander, Corridon M. Wassell, Medical Corps, United States Naval Reserve.
Thank you, everybody. Having lived in China 14 years, I feel and believe I know something of the Chinese people. Their courage to fight for freedom should be an example to our United States of America. I have watched this forward movement from the first days of Sun Yat-sen, and I know it will be victorious and that it will succeed. I thank you.
Let us unite in prayer. Eternal God, who hath made of one blood all the nations of the earth, quicken the sense of our common brotherhood, and bring all peoples into new realizations of fellowship with each other and with thee. Amid the tragedy of the world today, we give thee thanks for China, for her long patience, her steadfast courage, her victorious spirit. Greaten our appreciation of her sufferings, dared and endured in uttermost sacrifice, and grant her a speedy deliverance from all her distresses. We rejoice in the unbroken friendship of our two nations and pray that mutual respect, trust, and goodwill may ever increase between us. Amen.
China gives us, for this precious hour, a great and gallant guest, a woman, slim and fragile as a woman is, with all of woman's immemorial strength. These two small hands, a woman's hands, have swept the cobwebs from a nation's past. These hands have lit dark corners in its home, have built its schools, cared for its young, and nursed its war-made wounds. These hands, a woman's hands, have helped to shape a nation's destiny. This heart, a woman's heart, whispers a simple woman's hope, and all the world must pause and heed. And yet, one does not speak of Madame Chiang Kai-shek unless one speaks of China, too, of China's yesterday, which was her heritage, China's tomorrow, which is her life. China of yesterday, of many yesterdays, a vast and ageless people drowsing in the sun of untold years. 500,000 years, the scientists will say, and give you proof that 500,000 years ago, the world's first man, this man of China, walked the earth in human majesty. He walked the earth and learned to know this land in which he found himself. The thirsty Gobi Desert, the luxuriant green Hainan, the grim white cold of North Manchuria, the steaming heat of Canton in the south, summer, winter, autumn, spring. He learned to know the land in all its varied changing moods. And as the centuries rolled by uncounted, slowly the knowledge deepened into love. Yes, this man of China loved his land as only they can love who tend the soil in simple husbandry, who seed the rich, warm bosom of the earth and wait through anxious days until it yields and bears and brings forth life. He loved his land, and all he asked was peace. Safe behind his great stone wall, he lived and worked and dreamed his dreams and gave them to the world. You lovely ladies, sleek and glamorous, thank China for your shining silks. You sailor on a dark and angry sea, thank China for the compass that will bring you safe to port. You fathers, mothers, reading of some loved one far away, thank China for the gift of print, for the gift of paper on which the words appear. You world, counting the money of your weekly wage, drinking from clean porcelain cups, thank China for that too. But even more, for treasures of the mind, for great and glowing thought, Confucius, Lao Tzu, the ripened wisdom of all time. Thank China, world, for graciousness and beauty, health and hope. Thank China from the bottom of your heart. So much did China give us then. China that was at peace, a gentle and a generous people, loving the land on which they toil. How beautiful the little villages in spring, the spring of China's life. Plum blossoms everywhere, magnolias, roses, hyacinths, all kinds and colors, blending their perfume in rich and subtle harmony. In every street, the season's happy sign. The traveling barber with his tuning fork. The dry goods peddler with his little drum. The sharpener of knives who sings out merrily as he taps his gong. The children, too. The children in gay colored costumes marching out to greet the spring. The children garlanded with flowers, giving their youthful blessing to the earth, while life itself is young and all the world is newly born. So went the springtime of a peaceful nation's life. So went the spring in quiet happiness. So went China's summer, too. But as the sun of many years passed by, a shadow fell across the land. The shadow of the great stone wall. And there were those who looked upon the wall and wished it down, who saw it no longer as a symbol of a people's safety and its strength. To them, the wall was but a barrier within whose high forbidding limits China lived alone, apart, its wealth and wisdom doomed to wither in the shade. Prophetic Dr. Sun Yat-sen, dynamic Chiang Kai-shek. They looked beyond the wall, across the seas. From far away, they heard a melody that echoed and resounded in their hearts and nurtured their vision of what was to be. China vitalized again. The new democracy, a people free and equal, governed by their own consent with liberty and justice and equal opportunity for all. And then they looked upon the wall again and saw what they must do. They made the first small breach, and through it poured the stream of life. New life for China, new dreams, new energies, new railroads, factories and roads, new colleges, and universities. The wall was crumbling fast. Soon, China would be standing with the world in democratic fellowship. Soon, very soon, would come the harvest time, the new and greater harvest of their hopes. Soon would they reap the fruits of field and loom and scholar's industry, the fruits of plow and lathe and whirling wheel. Soon would the factory, farm, and laboratory add new riches to new China's life. Soon would the nation celebrate its harvest. Celebrate in joy and thanks. China's harvest might have been, but for the sudden blight. September 18th, 1931, high over Mukden, great metal birds with blood-red suns upon their wings. Great metal birds that drop their metal eggs and spawn a brood of death below. Joyous harvest now, no lifting of the heart. Through China flows the sound of mourning and lament. Mukden is but first, then Shanghai, Shenhequan, Reno that guards the inner province of Mongolia. Through blood-dipped years, the shameful pattern is made clear. Strike by surprise, Japan. Strike by surprise, as you will strike another peaceful nation on another day. And China, against all odds, fights back. China alone fights back for all the world. China that was never bred for war. China in the bitter winter of her life. (1937), Shanghai again. Attacked by land and sea and air. A holocaust. 4 months later, Nanking falls. Tidal wave of death is sweeping on the land. And now, to those who live along the coast, to helpless millions living in the blasted shambles of their homes, to others living in the open fields, a message comes. A voice resounding down the Yangtze from the ruins of Wuhan.
My people in the coastal regions, go to the west. Go to the west.
They hear the voice and listen to the plan.
Go to the west, but first put field and dwelling to the torch. Burn and destroy. Leave no substance for the enemy.
With hope they listen. With courage they obey. They scorch the earth, this gentle people who have tilled the soil since time began. They burn the land they love, so it will give no comfort to the foe. They leave it seared and desolate. and turn their faces to the west. In pride and dignity they go, each man and woman with some tiny fragment of his life. The farmer with his spade and hoe, the mother with her tiny babe, the blacksmith with his forge, the student too, the student with a precious volume tucked beneath his arm. Westward they go, but take along the tools of life, the tools of hand and heart and mind with which to build again. Westward they go, not only from the villages, from towns and cities too, for they can also hear the voice.
My people in the coastal cities, go to the west, go to the west.
The voice comes echoing through the city streets.
Go to the west. But as your brothers burn their fields, so must you strip your cities too. Leave nothing, nothing for the enemy to use.
And so they go, and take with them the things that are their life, huge steel crucibles and heavy looms, great dynamos and power plants, entire factories and mills. Piece by piece they tear them down and carry them along. 200,000 tons of heavy freight, carry them on human shoulders, a distance of 1,200 miles and more. Whole libraries and universities, the desks, the laboratory instruments, the bricks themselves, they take them all along, dig up the very roots of life so they may plant them in the free soil of the West, plant them for the great new life that is to be. For this is no disordered, fevered flight. This is a plan, migration. 50 million people on the march. Westward they go, by every route, by every means, by rail, by riverboat, by lumbering cart. And when no other means avail, they go on foot, trudge the whole weary 1,000 miles on foot. Steadily they go, while others in the rear put down their tools and take up arms and force the enemy to buy each foot of land with blood and death. Westward they go, coal miners and steel workers from Hancock, girls from the silk mills of Shanghai, farmers, students, architects, construction gangs, to build their new life in the West. And in these moving millions, not a trace of fear, no sign of panic or confusion on the way. They move along. There are many roads, and everywhere about them is the voice that gives them hope and confidence. One voice in all that wilderness of loss.
People of China, take heart. Take heart, my people.
One voice, the voice that speaks the plan, a soldier's voice, the generalissimo.
People of China, do not despair. Today you leave your homes. Tomorrow you will return again. You do but trade a little space for time.
Soldier's voice. By the soldier's side, a soldier's wife. Her glowing spirit fused with his, her strength and wisdom adding vibrant riches to his voice.
Here in the West, we have no time to mourn the past. Time and energy are but raw materials. We mix them with the courage of our faith and build the future for ourselves. Free men on free soil, living in justice, working in peace, and guarding, if need be, with our lives, the rights that must eternally belong to all mankind. This, my people, is the challenge and the promise that I give. Soldier, fight. Farmer, plow. Craftsman, work. Scholar, teach. And from these smoking ruins shall rise the China of tomorrow.
He speaks, and millions pledge their hearts in newfound hope. For in his words and in the vision that he builds, they see their destiny, their labor and their blood, their proud and willing sacrifice, uniting them with all free peoples everywhere. Their efforts join to forge the instruments of victory, to weld a just and lasting peace, and then the great stone wall forever down, China to carry her banner high among the nations of the earth. This is the China of tomorrow that speaks to us today, speaks through a valiant woman's voice, a woman of whom all China says that 50 armed divisions could be better spared than Madame Chiang Kai-shek, a soldier's wife, a statesman's wise and understanding counselor. Her spirit glows unquenchable, her eyes forever on the shining goal ahead. The winter of her nation's life gone by, the spring returned again. China reborn, the China that gives us, for this precious hour, our great and gallant guest.
Mr. Selznick, Mr. Smith, Mr. Mayor, members of the Welcome Committee, ladies and gentlemen, all experiences, happy or tragic, leave their impress and consciously or otherwise influence our subsequent thinking and attitude of mind. As the 7th year of China's resistance against Japanese aggression approaches, I shall sketch a few of the incidents most vividly infused on my mind, and, insofar as it is humanly possible, adopt a detached and objective view in examining the processes of mind which led me to certain convictions. For from them, perhaps, you may gain an insight into the lives and motives of a people who for many long years have endured the brutalities of being invaded. Time does not permit me to give you a balanced or comprehensive account of the war. I shall leave that task to the historians. I hesitated to talk to you about war in China, lest it should appear that my intent is to overemphasize the suffering of my people. On further thought, I believe you would understand that the purpose animating me lies in a saying in my own mind as well as in yours to profit by the lessons which these years should teach us. I shall not encumber you with a history of the perfidy of the Japanese. We can well find its counterpart and parallel in the talks between the Kurusu mission and the State Department just before the attack on Pearl Harbor, for they have a flavor familiarly reminiscent of those in the days following the Lukuchao incident, when Japan feigned negotiations with the Chinese government while massing her troops for total invasion. At the beginning of war in 1937, my duties as Secretary General of the Chinese Air Force kept me chiefly engaged in air activities. We had just reorganized the Air Force, and the total number of planes we had was pitifully and incredibly scanty, less than 300. Of these, something short of 100 were fighters and bombers. The Japanese, on the other hand, had approximately 5,000 fighting planes. On the very first day of air combat, our young cadets shot down 14 enemy bombers. We ourselves on that day sustained no irreparable loss, for although our planes were riddled with bullets, they still could fly. For 3 consecutive days, enemy planes attacked the same objective, the Hanchow Aviation School, and each time our airmen, flying archaic Hawk 2s and a few Hawk 3s, matched and outfought the enemy, shooting down a considerable number. The Japanese were completely bewildered and even went so far as to say that we had some secret beam which enabled our young pilots, many of whom were yet undergoing training, successfully to shoot down their bombers. At first, we too could not believe that the reports were entirely accurate. The charred remains of the enemy planes, however, bore witness to the veracity of the reports. As time passed, fewer and fewer combat planes remained to us, for most of the planes ordered before the war were not due for many months. The lack of replacements for our lost planes was further accentuated by the paucity of spare parts, and nowhere on the horizon shone there a ray of hope to mollify and alleviate our dire difficulties. Problem after problem stalked in nightmare procession. The Nanking Aerodrome did not have a runway sufficiently solid to allow the takeoff of the heavy Martin bombers, which eventually arrived and were then being assembled. A new runway had to be made. Where was the material to be found at such short notice, especially with the nation's transportation geared to more pressing tasks? A solution evolved. I asked myself, to what more appropriate use in such an emergency could the material on the excellent roads leading to Dr. Sun's mausoleum be put than this. So we decided to tear up those roads and take that material for the runway. But hardly was the first problem solved before another interlinked difficulty confronted us. Where could we find the labor? I thought of the thousands of refugees who were daily streaming into Nanking and undertook to appeal to them for help. Every able-bodied man responded. As the enemy planes bombed the city every day during daylight hours, the refugees worked by night, tens of thousands of them, by the dim light of kerosene lamps. Through concerted and unflagging toil, the heavy runway was completed in record time, thanks to the energy, persistence, and patriotism of the refugees, who gave their time and labor without stint and without murmur, asking in return no remuneration, no manifest recognition of their service. The need for planes became ever more pressing, and the devastation and destruction wrought by the enemy over the whole countryside made it imperative that we had to resort to measures which may seem ludicrous to you. Yet, what else could we do? Every effort must be made. Every means must be employed to equal the high morale of the army and the people. The constant cry of the young cadets was to give them anything which could fly. And so we put bomb racks on the Hawk 2s and 3s, which from that time on served both as bombers and so equipped the primary training planes, the fleets, with bomb racks. But alas, the latter were found to be too fragile and too slow to be effective. To those lads, however, any machine which could go soaring into the sky meant snatching that much edge off the vast initial advantage held by the enemy. We husbanded our small air force with the utmost care, and each mission was carefully planned so that for the least expenditure could be achieved the greatest result. It was heartbreaking to send the boys up to defend our capital from the skies or out on bombing missions, for the odds against them were so tremendous that each time many failed to come back. For many months I had worked with the boys and had learned to know them personally. They trusted me because they knew that what I had been telling them were my honest convictions, that we must fight for principles, that every man was to be judged on his own merits, that no favoritism was to be shown to anyone, but that absolute impartiality in spirit and in treatment was to prevail throughout the whole Air Force. Through my experience of that period, I have come to be reaffirmed in the belief that any service can be built up when the directing policy is based on impartiality and fairness, and when the ranks know that reward and punishment are meted out according to their just deserts. Meanwhile, the Japanese had concentrated their naval power at Wusong, and under its protection landed ever-increasing number of troops in the eastern part of the international settlement of Shanghai. Thus, whilst the enemy had the advantage of the international settlement as their base for attack, our troops had the disadvantage of the international settlement, for we were not allowed even to use it as a thoroughfare. Our soldiers, with totally inadequate mechanized equipment and with absolutely no air protection, fought on the outskirts of Shanghai, literally for every inch of land that the Japanese gained through the combined use of heavy artillery, naval guns, and incessant bombing. And the Japanese average gain was less than a mile a day. On that front, for 3 months, our troops fought with the fury of the inspired, whilst the Japanese military moaned that China was not playing fair because her troops did not know when they were defeated. The spirit of our soldiers shone with steadfast splendor, and their selflessness instilled courage and determination in our sorely tried and harassed people. It was all that the High Command could do to hold back the troops in their trenches. They wanted to combat the enemy at close quarters. So clear was their realization of the principles at stake, so great their indignation that good faith could be broken by the mere whim of those who knew only desecration. Wherever the Generalissimo went to hold conferences with his officers at the front, I accompanied him. The trips held dangers even when made in the dead of night, for rail traffic was disrupted by constant bombing and congested with troop movements, and on the highway road lights were turned off and all motor car headlights dimmed by black cloth, lest enemy planes should spot us. Once we arrived in Suzhou just when some troop trains had pulled in. The station was a shambles from repeated bombings, but the railway officials, tottering with weariness and lack of sleep, stuck doggedly at their work. Stretcher bearers work like wordless automatons, trying to clear the station platform of the wounded, while more and more wounded were unloaded. Clammy, sticky blood clung like glue to our thick walking shoes, while more blood seeped through the soles. Still more blood spattered over us as we stumbled through the closely packed station. The wounded were huddled in every inch of available space. Young men who a few hours before were full of vitality and vigor, and who now were slowly being drained of life itself. Only an occasional gasp of pain echoed across the roofless station. Most of the sufferers bore their anguish in stoic silence. One young lad, stretching out his hand, tugged at my coat as I passed him, murmuring, "Water, water." I sent an aide-de-camp to get some water. Immediately, a medical officer advised me that in the case of stomach wounds, no water should be given. I shall never forget the look on the young lad's face as I sorrowfully shook my head and told him that for his own good I could do nothing for him. That face, so young, almost that of a child, twitching with excruciating pain made by the gaping wound. How can I ever forget? Why should the Almighty select those so young, so innocent, so untried, to be offered as sacrament on the communion table of national honor? Have they perhaps sinned against the tenets of God? Or is theirs the vicarious lot of retributive justice? It is true that life, if it is of any worth, must have as its constant companion honor. Death occurs as the final culmination, inevitable in the processes of life. And indeed, it falls not to all men to share the privilege with the crusaders of truth, to breathe their last while in line of duty, and to have the benediction of knowing during their last conscious moments that they are dying in the upholding of ideals more meaningful than life. War is cruel, terrible, and revolting, and should never be permitted to recur. We who have experienced it at its worst cannot extol nor glorify it, but we take comfort that the last moments of our youths in making the supreme sacrifice are illuminated by the lambent glory of righteousness and justice, while the youths of the enemy are decimated without solace, that they are dying in order that civilization may survive. Return. As the enemy landed increasingly long-range guns and heavy artillery, the time came when the central government decided that all civilians should evacuate Nanking. Hundreds of thousands of people who hitherto had made the capital their home had to take what they could carry and leave the rest to be consumed by fire, in adopting the strategy of what is now commonly called the scorched earth policy. In no wise did we want the enemy to have any more advantage than we could help. The trees which we had planted so proudly 10 years before in our high hopes to make Nanking truly the capital beautiful had to be hewn down so that the artillery could have the necessary unobstructed view. To have watched the saplings gradually grow year by year into sturdy trees, and finally to witness their tops cut off, was like seeing live pets killed before our very eyes. The Generalissimo and I were amongst the last of the officials to leave Nanking. Before we left, we took steps for the removal of the irreplaceable and priceless treasures of the National Museum of Art to quarters safe from enemy looting. Later, I went outside of the city wall for a final look at the now empty buildings of the School for the Children of the Revolution. Here and there, in the fields beyond the campus, I saw thatched huts, not yet devoured by flames, some outside walls still intact, and hanging on them strings of dried beans, peas, lentils, and cobs of corn. They were the pick of the harvest and had been carefully saved as seeds for the next crop. But for these humble folks who for generations had lived, loved, and had their being on the soil, there was now no next crop, not for many years. Anyway, not until after victory is won. During such moments, I wondered whether the mania of the bloodthirsty is ever slaked by the display constantly before their eyes of the human suffering and havoc they had brought. Are they such diabolic Lucifers that they can only revel in human misery? Well might I have such musings, for the world now knows to what extent the Japanese military carried their calculated cruelties after they occupied Nanking and other areas. How they plundered and stripped the terrified populace of all means of livelihood, molested our women, rounded up all able-bodied men, tied them together like animals, forced them to dig their own graves, and finally kicked them in and buried them alive. Settled temporarily in Hankow, we realized that the war would be long and hard, and that to sustain a defensive war of the magnitude and length we had in mind, Hankow was merely a stepping-off place to enable us to take stock of our weaknesses and reassess our strength in making preparations for the future. In equipment, the enemy undoubtedly outstripped us in every way, for theirs was a modern army with all auxiliary services complete, including mechanized units, trained engineer corps, fully equipped medical contingents, in addition to a powerful navy and an equally powerful air force. And what did China have? We had no navy to speak of, only an embryo air force and an infantry equipped mainly with rifles, machine guns, and outmoded artillery pieces. But we had manpower which willingly volunteered its flesh and blood. We had fighting spirit, for we knew we were struggling for justice and righteousness. And also, we had the advantages of time and space. It was our intention and strategy to make the enemy pay, and pay dearly, for every inch of land they wrested from us, so that in time we could wear them out, provided that the will to win could withstand the onslaught of steel and high explosives. China's long-continued resistance in the face of formidable difficulties proved that our envisionment of the situation, both psychological and military, was correct. To those skeptics who sneered at China's magnetic strategy, I should like to ask, what other peoples in the modern world has endured the agonies of war for so long and so bravely, held so tenaciously and so staunchly to the defense of principles as the Chinese people? And in the face of such odds in fighting equipment, of these same skeptics I should also like to ask, given the same conditions, what would they have done? In our position, what could they have done? I should like to reiterate here that we have been fighting not only for our homes and hearths. We have been fighting for the upholding of pledges and principles, because the violation of one pledge means the breaking of the whole chain of international decency and honor. During those Hankow days, the Generalissimo and I were constantly making trips to the various fronts. The ever-recurring spectacle of the hundreds of thousands of our well-to-do countrymen reduced to being refugees, fleeing on the roads over the countryside, being bombed and machine-gunned by enemy planes, and of the thousands of dead on the roadside, awaiting burial, are ghastly memories, impossible to forget. When will the ghosts of our bombed cities, ruined villages, and myriads of men, women, and little children murdered in cold blood be laid? Meanwhile, there was work to be done for the living. As war continued, women's volunteer organizations sprang up all over the country. Systematic coordination, however, was lacking, and as a result, duplication of work and confusion prevailed. At a conference called in the hills of Kuling, 50 women leaders representing every section of the country came together. During those 10 days of the meeting, we laid the foundations of the National Women's Advisory Council, which all agreed should function as a supreme body in directing women's war efforts. We established various departments to meet war emergencies without interfering with existing organizations, but by supplementing and coordinating local efforts. The training of girls and women to work amongst the wounded, the refugees, and as liaison between the people and the army, the care of the war orphans, the increase of production, all received the consideration they deserved. The response to this movement on the part of women throughout the country was electric. Branch associations mushroomed overnight. Differences of opinion were freely aired and hotly contested, but the final decisions of the Women's Advisory Council ruled. From this experience, I am convinced that women can work together. They can, they will, and they must. Women of every creed and belief, every nationality, provided the cause is big enough and the challenge worth accepting. A few months later, the central government issued hurried orders for the evacuation of Hankow. I had gone to the boat to bid goodbye to several hundred of the girls whom I had helped to train for war work. How I hoped and prayed that they would reach their destination, for just the day before, a boatload of refugees, including many of our war orphans, was bombed, and all perished. As I was walking home, I noticed that over the gutters in the streets, there still remained thick slabs of iron grates. Would they not be used by the enemy to be made into bombs to kill more of our people? I mentioned this to the Generalissimo, and he issued orders that the metal should be taken up and thrown into the river. The Generalissimo and I took the last plane which left the night before Hankow was occupied by the enemy. Chongqing, the wartime capital, now became the center of activity. The same difficulties which obtained at Hankow followed us there. Even the government organizations had a hard time trying to find quarters, for all of a sudden, millions of refugees poured into this district from the Hankow area. But there was one difference. We had already sustained the first impact of war, and the people had become accustomed to makeshifts in living. Hardly had we arrived, however, before the enemy air force started their bombing and strafing again, hoping thus to break down the morale of our resistance. For several years during the clear season, whenever the city was not enveloped in opaque fog, we were constantly subject to overhead attacks. In fact, Chongqing and its vicinity never had a respite until the famous Flying Tigers grappled with the air marauders and fought them off. But, alas, there were not enough tigers to patrol the vast skies over China, nor enough to give even a little overhead protection to our valiant armies spread out in the 9 war zones. Our Chinese Air Force, as time went on, dwindled, for although Russia supplied us with some planes, the need was ever greater than what was obtained. But wherever we could, we made desperate raids over the enemy's supply bases. For the rest, we had to be content with training pilots in the hope that someday planes would be forthcoming. Anyone who has an idea of the topography of Chongqing would understand the heartbreaking hardships our people had to endure. The city itself is situated on a tongue of land at the juncture of 2 rivers, the Charling and the Yangtze. Steep stone steps lace their ways up and down the hillsides, and the old houses were built in such a way that there was only one entrance. Oftentimes, when a bomb exploded and cut off the one entrance, the householders would be trapped without any means of egress. Whole sections of the city were turned into shambles by a few bombs, as the houses were so closely packed together that one incendiary bomb could set off a whole block into flames. We knew days when it was impossible to obtain coffins as the toll of death mounted. In time, all the business section of the city was demolished, so that it was possible to stand in the midst of the ruins and get an unobstructed view of the river on both sides. It is to the credit of the resurgent spirit of our people that they were not intimidated, for after each bombing, scarcely had the air raid siren trailed off its last echo before the surviving householders returned to their burnt shops and homes and began to salvage whatever they could. A few days later, temporary shacks and buildings would make their appearance on the old sites. Some days the raids were so close and numerous that no one had time to prepare food. Hours were wasted in the dugout, valuable hours needed for work and rest. But moonlight nights were the worst, for the marauding planes, timed with devilish cunning, came in successive waves. Terrible tiredness permeated every nerve and bone, so that it was preferable to risk being bombed to death than to seek safety. But we knew that the enemy was trying to break our morale through sheer physical exhaustion, We were therefore inflexible in our determination not to give in. No greater tribute could be paid to our sorely tried people than this, that in all their suffering, never did they complain against their leaders. Never did they falter in the determination that the enemy must be driven from our shores. They had faith, too, that in the end, America and the other democratic powers would realize that it was not only for ourselves that we were fighting, and that by continuing to engage the enemy, we were giving time to the democracies to prepare their defenses. Here I should like to say that neither we nor posterity can deprive unerring tribute to the foresight and statesmanship of President Roosevelt when he envisaged to the full the implications and consequences of the struggle of right against might, and took decisive measures to enable America to become the arsenal of the democracies. History and posterity will characterize your President's unswerving convictions and his moral courage to implement them. We take pride in the fact that amid all the stern and never-ending demands of war, we are preparing for just and permanent peace and for the strenuous world building that lies before us. You, too, are taking similar steps, and like us, you are determined to contribute your share in the organization of a new and happier social order as you are in prosecuting the war. We in China, through these years of suffering, have not turned to indiscriminate, galling hate of the enemy. We shall not abrade the sharp, stony path we must travel before our common victory is won. But we, like you and the other United Nations, shall see to it that the four freedoms will not assume the flaccid statues of ethical postulates, no matter how belated may be the final victory. We shall not be cozened of an equitable peace. We shall not permit aggression to raise its satanic head and threaten man's greatest heritage, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for all peoples.